In 1867 Nebraska Territory, a starving widower named Jacob shocks an auction crowd by purchasing Amara's freedom with his last $75, unaware that the broken woman he's trying to save will become the one who heals his shattered heart. But when a ruthless land grabber arrives with a deadly scheme to destroy them both, will their newfound bond be strong enough to survive the price that true freedom demands? The iron chains around Amara's wrists had turned her skin raw and bleeding. She stood on the wooden platform in the center of Millbrook's dusty Main Street, trying not to think about how many other women had stood in this exact spot before her. The September morning sun beat down on Nebraska Territory like a hammer on an anvil, and sweat dripped down her back under the rough cotton dress they'd given her for the auction. "Step up! Step up!" shouted the auctioneer, a fat man with a red face and yellow teeth, fresh from the eastern markets. "This one's got strong arms and a good back for field work." Amara kept her eyes on the distant wheat fields that stretched beyond the town. Those golden stalks swayed in the breeze like they were dancing, free to move however the wind wanted them to. She wished she could dance like that. Instead, she had to stand still while strange men walked around her, poking at her arms and checking her teeth like she was a horse they might buy. "Look at those shoulders," called out a bearded farmer from the crowd. "Bet she could pull a plow if you needed her to." The other men laughed, and Amara felt her cheeks burn with shame. She touched the small wooden bird hidden in her dress pocket, the only thing she had left from her mother. Her mama had carved it from a piece of oak and told her, "Baby girl, this bird's got wings, just like you do inside. Don't you ever forget that." But standing on this platform with chains on her wrists, Amara felt like her wings had been cut off a long time ago. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" the auctioneer bellowed. "Strong as an ox and twice as useful. Perfect for harvest season." $40, shouted the bearded farmer. "45, called another voice. Amara closed her eyes and tried to remember her daughter's face. Little Lily had been only 7 when they sold her away to a plantation down south. That was 12 years ago, but Amara could still hear her baby's voice calling, "Mama," as they dragged her away. The memory cut through her heart like a knife, just like it did every single day. $48. The bidding was getting heated now. She opened her eyes and looked at the crowd again. Most of the men had mean faces or greedy eyes. They looked at her like she was a thing, not a person. Like she was a tool they could use up and throw away when she got too old or too broken to work anymore. But then she noticed one man who was different from the others. He stood at the back of the crowd, tall and thin like a scarecrow. His clothes were old and patched, and his hat was pulled down low over his face. While all the other men were staring at her and pointing, this strange man was looking down at his boots like he didn't want to be there at all. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer asked, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty handkerchief. The thin man in the back suddenly lifted his head. For just a moment, Amara saw his face clearly. He had deep lines around his eyes, like he'd been sad for a very long time. His cheeks were hollow, like he hadn't been eating enough food. But his eyes weren't mean or greedy like the others. They looked tired, and maybe a little bit scared. $50, he said in a quiet voice that somehow carried across the whole crowd. Everyone turned to stare at him. The auctioneer squinted in his direction, surprised by the bid. $50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 55? The bearded farmer scratched his chin and looked the thin man up and down. You sure you got $50, Jacob? You look like you ain't had a good meal in months. So the thin man's name was Jacob. Amara watched as his face turned red with embarrassment, but he stood up straighter and pulled some crumpled bills from his coat pocket. I got the money, Jacob said firmly. 55, shouted another farmer, trying to outbid him. Jacob's jaw got tight, and Amara could see his hands shaking a little as he held his money. She wondered why he wanted to buy her. He didn't look like he had enough money to feed himself, let alone another person. Maybe he was just as desperate as she was in his own way. $60, Jacob said, and his voice was stronger this time. The crowd got quiet. $60 was a lot of money for a poor farmer. The other men looked at Jacob like he was crazy for bidding so high when he clearly didn't have much money to spare. "Going once for $60, the auctioneer called out. "Going twice." Amara held her breath. Something about this Jacob felt different from all the other men who had bought and sold her over the years. Maybe it was the way he'd looked ashamed when he first bid, or the way he was spending money he probably couldn't afford to lose. Or maybe it was just that he was the only person in the whole crowd who had looked her in the eyes like she was a real human being. "Sold!" The auctioneer banged his hammer down. "To Jacob for $60. Jacob walked toward the platform with slow, careful steps, like he was afraid he might change his mind if he moved too fast. Up close, Amara could see that his brown coat was held together with patches and his boots had holes in them. This was not a rich man who bought people for fun. This was someone who had just spent money he needed for something else. "I'll need to see your money first," the auctioneer said, eyeing Jacob's shabby clothes suspiciously. Jacob pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out the bills one by one. His hands shook slightly as he handed over the money, and Amara noticed that some of the bills were torn and dirty, like they'd been saved up for a long time. She wondered what he'd been planning to buy with that money before he decided to spend it on her instead. "Papers are all in order," the auctioneer said after counting the bills twice. "She's all yours now. Name's Amara, according to the bill of sale." Jacob nodded but didn't look at Amara directly. Instead, he turned to the man with the keys to her chains. "I want those shackles off her." "Well now, that's up to you," the man said with a shrug. "But most folks keep him on for the first few weeks, just to make sure they don't get any ideas about running off." "Take them off," Jacob said again, and this time his voice was hard as iron. The man unlocked the chains, and they fell to the wooden platform with a loud clang. Amara rubbed her wrists where the metal had cut into her skin, hardly believing that the weight she'd carried for months was finally gone. She looked up at Jacob, trying to understand what kind of man he was. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob's face turned red again, and he looked away quickly. "We should get going," he mumbled. "Got a long ride ahead of us." He led her to an old wagon hitched to a tired-looking brown horse. The wagon was loaded with bags of seed and farming tools, and Amara could see that everything Jacob owned was worn out and well used. He helped her climb up onto the wooden seat, being careful not to touch her more than necessary. As they drove away from the town, Amara snuck glances at the strange man who had bought her freedom from those chains. Jacob kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she could see his knuckles were white from gripping the reins so tight. He was nervous about something, but she couldn't figure out what. "Where are we going?" she asked after they'd been riding in silence for a while. "My farm," Jacob said without looking at her. "About 10 miles north of town." "What kind of work will I be doing?" Jacob was quiet for such a long time that Amara thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he said, "I got a wheat farm. Been trying to work it by myself since my wife died. But," he stopped talking and shook his head. "Well, it's too much for one person." So he'd had a wife who died. That explained the sadness in his eyes and the hollow look in his cheeks. Amara knew what it felt like to lose someone you loved. The pain of missing her daughter Lily was like a rock in her chest that never went away. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said softly. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't say anything. They rode through rolling hills covered in tall grass that moved like ocean waves in the wind. The Nebraska Territory was bigger and more open than any place Amara had ever seen. The sky stretched from one end of the world to the other, so blue and wide it almost hurt to look at. She'd spent most of her life in small, dark places, slave quarters, auction houses, the backs of wagons with canvas covers. All this open space made her feel dizzy and small. "It's beautiful," she said, almost to herself. Jacob glanced at her with surprise, like he'd forgotten she was there. "Sarah always said that too," he said quietly. "My wife. She loved watching the wheat grow." "What happened to her?" Amara asked, then immediately wished she hadn't. It wasn't her place to ask personal questions. But Jacob didn't seem angry. He just looked sadder than before. "Fever took her last spring. Started with a cough. Then she got weak and couldn't eat. Doctor couldn't do nothing for her. His voice got so quiet Amara could barely hear him. She died right there in our bed, holding my hand. Amara felt tears prick her eyes. She knew what it was like to have someone you loved torn away from you. That must have been very hard. Haven't been the same since, Jacob admitted. Can't seem to get anything done right. The wheat's half dead, the barn's falling apart, and I can barely keep myself fed, let alone the livestock. Now Amara understood why he'd bought her. He wasn't looking for a slave to boss around, he was looking for help. Someone to share the work that was too much for him to handle alone. It was still slavery, she knew that. But maybe it would be different than the other places she'd been. Maybe this Jacob would treat her like a person instead of a thing. I'm a hard worker, she told him. I can do whatever you need. Jacob nodded but still wouldn't look directly at her. There's a small room off the back of the house. It's got a bed and a window. It's yours. A room with a window. Amara couldn't remember the last time she'd had a window to look out of. Most places kept slaves in windowless shacks or basements where they couldn't see the sky. The thought of having her own space with light coming in made her heart flutter like the wooden bird in her pocket. As they topped a hill, she saw Jacob's farm spread out below them. The house was small and painted white, though the paint was peeling in places. There was a red barn that leaned to one side like it was tired, and fields of wheat that looked yellowed and sick. Everything about the place looked lonely and forgotten, like it was slowly dying without someone to love it. But Amara could see the bones of something beautiful underneath all the neglect. With some work and care, this could be a place where things grew instead of just surviving. She found herself wondering what it would be like to have a hand in making something bloom again. Amara woke up before dawn to the sound of Jacob chopping wood behind the house like his life depended on it. Through her small window, she could see him swinging the axe with angry, desperate movements, sweat pouring down his face even though the October morning was cold enough to see her breath. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the way he attacked that pile of logs like they were his enemies. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. Jacob didn't notice her at first, too focused on splitting piece after piece of wood with violent chops that echoed across the empty fields. "Jacob?" she called softly. He spun around, startled, the axe still raised in his hands. His eyes were red and wild, like he hadn't slept all night. "Oh, Amara, I was just..." He lowered the axe and wiped his face with his sleeve. Needed firewood. But Amara could see the huge pile of split logs behind him, enough firewood to last through 3 winters. This wasn't about staying warm. This was about a man trying to chop his way through whatever demons were chasing him in the dark. "Bad dreams?" she asked gently. Jacob's shoulders sagged like someone had let all the air out of him. "Every night since Sarah died. I see her face, hear her voice calling for me. But when I try to reach her..." He shook his head. "She just fades away like smoke." Amara knew about dreams like that. She'd been having them about her daughter Lily for 12 years, dreams where she could almost touch her baby's hand before waking up to find nothing but empty air. The pain never got smaller, it just learned to hide better during the day. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make us some breakfast." Jacob looked surprised. "You don't have to do that. I mean, I know you're here to work, but cooking wasn't... I didn't expect..." "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Amara asked, looking at his thin face and the way his clothes hung loose on his frame. Jacob thought about it for a long moment. "Can't remember," he admitted. The kitchen was a mess of dirty dishes and empty cans. Amara could see that Jacob had been living on nothing but stale bread and whatever he could eat straight from a tin. The stove was cold and covered in dust, like it hadn't been used since his wife died. She found some eggs from the hen house and a few potatoes that weren't too soft yet. As she cooked, Jacob sat at the kitchen table and watched her with curious eyes, like he'd forgotten what it looked like to have someone prepare food for him. "Sarah used to make the best biscuits in the county," he said quietly. "Won 3 blue ribbons at the harvest fair." "Tell me about her," Amara said, stirring the eggs in the pan. Jacob's face lit up for the first time since she'd met him. "She was tiny, barely came up to my shoulder, but she could outwork any man I knew. Had this laugh that sounded like music, and she'd sing while she worked in the garden. Made everything feel alive. Amara served the eggs and potatoes on 2 chipped plates and sat down across from him. Jacob stared at the food like he'd forgotten how to eat a proper meal. "She sounds wonderful," Amara said. "She was." Jacob took a bite and closed his eyes. This is really good. "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence as the sun came up over the wheat fields. Through the kitchen window, Amara could see the extent of the farm's problems. The wheat was turning brown and brittle. The barn door hung crooked on broken hinges, and weeds had taken over what must have been Sarah's vegetable garden. "How long since you've worked the fields?" she asked. Jacob looked embarrassed. "Been hard to find the energy. Everything just feels so." He struggled for the words. So pointless without her here to share it with. Amara understood that feeling too. After they sold Lily away, she'd felt like a ghost walking through her own life, going through the motions but not really living. But looking around Jacob's kitchen, seeing how he'd given up on taking care of himself, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The urge to fix something that was broken. "What if we started small?" she suggested. "Just one project at a time?" Jacob looked at her with something that might have been hope. "You really think we could get this place running again?" "I think we have to try," Amara said. "For Sarah. And for us." That afternoon, they walked through the dying wheat fields together. Jacob explained how the crop had been his pride and joy, how he'd planned to expand the farm and maybe buy some cattle with the profits. But when Sarah got sick, he'd spent all his time caring for her and let the wheat go too long without water. "It's not completely dead," Amara said, running her fingers through the dry stalks. "Some of these plants just need water and attention. We could save maybe half the crop if we work fast." Jacob looked skeptical. "The well's been giving us trouble too. Water comes up muddy more often than not." "Then we fix the well first," Amara said simply. As they walked back toward the house, Jacob suddenly stopped and turned to her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "I mean, I bought you to work, but this is more than just work." Amara thought about how to explain it. How could she tell him that fixing his broken farm felt like trying to fix her own broken heart? That having a purpose again, something to build instead of just survive, made her feel human for the first time in years? "Maybe because nobody ever asked me what I wanted to do before," she said finally. "They just told me what I had to do." Jacob studied her face for a long moment. "What do you want to do?" The question hit her like a surprise punch to the chest. Want? When was the last time anyone had cared what she wanted? When was the last time she'd even allowed herself to want anything beyond just making it through another day? "I want to make things grow," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I want to fix what's broken and see it come back to life." Jacob nodded slowly, like he was beginning to understand something important. "Then that's what we'll do." As the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amara felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since she was a child, she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do. It wasn't freedom, not the kind the law would recognize, but it was close enough to taste. 3 weeks later, Amara's hands were permanently stained with mud and her back ached from dawn to dusk, but she'd never felt more alive. She and Jacob had fallen into a rhythm of working together that surprised them both, him handling the heavy lifting while she figured out the problems that needed solving. The well was running clear again. Half the wheat had been saved, and the barn door no longer hung like a broken wing. But it was the small moments between the work that caught Amara off guard. Like how Jacob had started leaving extra food on her plate without saying anything about it. Or how he'd fixed the lock on her door so it only worked from the inside, giving her something she'd never had before, the power to keep people out of her space. Or how he'd stopped giving her orders and started asking, "Would you mind helping me with this?" On this particular morning, she woke to find a cup of coffee waiting for her on the kitchen table, still steaming hot. Jacob was already outside feeding the chickens, but he'd taken the time to make her coffee before starting his own day. It was such a small thing, but it made her chest feel warm in a way she hadn't experienced since Lily was small. "Morning," Jacob said when she joined him in the yard. He looked healthier than when she'd first met him. His cheeks had filled out a little and there was color in his face again. "Morning," she replied, sipping the coffee. "This is perfect. Thank you." Jacob's ears turned red like they always did when she thanked him for something. "Sarah taught me how to make it," he said. Said the secret was letting the ground sit for exactly 3 minutes before pouring. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without looking like he might cry. Amara took that as a good sign. They worked together repairing fence posts until the afternoon, when Jacob suddenly stopped hammering and looked toward the road. A dust cloud was approaching, someone was coming to visit. "You expecting anyone?" Amara asked, shading her eyes with her hand. Jacob shook his head, but his whole body had gone tense. "Nobody ever comes out here anymore. Not since." The visitor turned out to be a well-dressed man on a fancy black horse. He was maybe 40 years old with slicked back hair and a gold watch chain across his vest. Everything about him screamed money and importance, from his shiny boots to the way he sat in his saddle like he owned the world. "Jacob," the man called out in a booming voice as he rode up to them. "My old friend, you're looking better than the last time I saw you." But Jacob didn't look happy to see this visitor. His face had gone pale and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Marcus," he said flatly, "what brings you all the way out here?" Marcus swung down from his horse and looked around the farm with calculating eyes. When his gaze landed on Amara, she felt like a rabbit being studied by a wolf. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her skin crawl. "Well now," Marcus said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you didn't tell me you'd acquired some help, and such pretty help at that." Amara moved closer to Jacob, every instinct telling her this man was dangerous. "Amara helps with the farm work," Jacob said carefully. "Nothing more." Of course," Marcus laughed, but his eyes never left Amara's face. "Though I have to say, Jacob, buying field hands when you can barely feed yourself seems a bit extravagant." "What do you want, Marcus?" Jacob asked bluntly. Marcus pulled out a leather folder and opened it with a flourish. "I'm here to make you an offer, old friend. A very generous offer for your land and everything on it." Jacob's jaw tightened. "My farm's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Jacob. It's just a matter of finding the right price." Marcus spread papers out on the fence post between them. "I'm prepared to offer you $2,000 for the whole property. That's more than fair market value, especially considering the condition things are in." $2,000 was a fortune more money than most people in Nebraska Territory would see in their entire lives. But Amara could see Jacob's face getting redder by the minute. "I said it's not for sale," Jacob repeated. Marcus's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, showing something cold and mean underneath. "Jacob, let's be reasonable here. You're one man trying to work a 100-acre farm. Even with your assistant, there's no way you can make this place profitable again." "We're doing just fine," Jacob said, but his voice shook slightly. "Are you?" Marcus looked around at the half-dead wheat and the patched-up barn. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're barely hanging on. And winter's coming fast." Amara felt something cold settle in her stomach. This Marcus wasn't just offering to buy the farm. He was threatening them. She could hear it in his voice, see it in the way his smile had turned sharp around the edges. "Think about it, Jacob," Marcus continued, rolling up his papers. "A man's got to be practical. You take my offer, you can buy yourself a nice little house in town and live comfortable for the rest of your days. Keep fighting to save this place, and you'll lose everything when the bank comes calling." After Marcus rode away, Jacob stood staring at the dust cloud his horse had kicked up, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that hurt his brain. "Who was that?" Amara asked quietly. "Marcus Hartwell, richest man in the county. He's been trying to buy up all the farms around here for years." Jacob's voice was bitter. "Sarah never trusted him. Said he had the eyes of a snake." "What did he mean about the bank?" Jacob rubbed his face with both hands. "I borrowed money against the farm to pay for Sarah's doctor bills. If I can't make the payments. He didn't finish the sentence, but Amara understood. They'd lose everything. How much time do we have? She asked. Bank payments due in 6 weeks. Right after harvest. Jacob looked at their half-saved wheat crop with despair. Even if we bring in every stalk, it won't be enough to cover what I owe. Amara felt her heart sink, but then something stubborn flared up inside her chest. She'd spent her whole life having things taken away from her freedom, her daughter, her dignity. She wasn't going to let them take away the first place that had ever felt like home. Then we'll find another way, she said firmly. Jacob looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Amara, you don't understand. Marcus Hartwell always gets what he wants. Always. Maybe, Amara said, thinking of the cold calculation in Marcus's eyes when he'd looked at her. But he doesn't know what we're willing to fight for. The first snowflake landed on Amara's nose while she was hanging laundry behind the house, and she knew their time was running out. Winter in Nebraska Territory came fast and mean, trapping people inside their homes for months at a time. If they were going to save the farm, they had to do it before the snow got too deep to work. She rushed inside to find Jacob staring at a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. His face was white as fresh snow, and his hands shook as he held the paper. What is it? She asked, though she already feared the answer. Banks moved up the payment date, Jacob said in a hollow voice. They want the money in 2 weeks instead of 6. Says here they've had reports that the farm isn't being properly maintained. Amara snatched the letter from his hands and read it herself. The words were full of fancy legal talk, but the message was clear: pay up now or lose everything. At the bottom, she noticed something that made her blood boil. Look at this, she said, pointing to a line of small print. It says this decision was made based on a report from a concerned citizen. Jacob, someone told the bank we were failing. Jacob's eyes went dark with understanding. Marcus, he's trying to force us out before we can bring in the harvest, Amara said, her mind racing. If the bank takes the farm now, guess who'll be ready to buy it at auction for half what it's worth? They spent that evening going through every option they could think of. Jacob counted and recounted the money he had saved, barely enough to cover a quarter of what he owed. Amara suggested selling everything they could spare, but even the livestock and farm equipment wouldn't bring in enough cash. Maybe I should just take Marcus's offer, Jacob said finally, slumping in his chair like a defeated man. At least then we'd both have something instead of losing everything. No, Amara said fiercely. This is your home, Sarah's home. We're not giving up without a fight. But as she lay in her small room that night, listening to the wind howl around the house, Amara wondered if fighting was enough. She'd been fighting her whole life, fighting to stay alive, fighting to keep hope, fighting to remember who she was underneath all the pain. Sometimes fighting just meant you got hurt for longer before you finally lost anyway. The next morning brought a surprise visitor that changed everything. Amara was feeding the chickens when she heard a wagon rattling up the road. Instead of Marcus's fancy horse, this time it was old Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring farm, bundled up in a thick coat and driving her ancient mule. Morning, dear, Mrs. Patterson called out as she climbed down from her wagon. Brought you some fresh bread and came to see how you folks are getting along. Mrs. Patterson was a tiny woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been living on the frontier for 40 years and had buried 2 husbands, but she still had more energy than people half her age. She was also the biggest gossip in 3 counties, which meant she knew everyone's business whether they wanted her to or not. We're managing, Amara said carefully, not sure how much they should tell her about their troubles. Oh, I'm sure you are, Mrs. Patterson said with a knowing smile. Though I hear tell that Marcus Hartwell's been sniffing around here lately. That man's like a buzzard. Only shows up when he smells something dying. Jacob came out of the barn just then, looking surprised to see their visitor. Mrs. Patterson, this is unexpected. I'll bet it is, the old woman said with a cackle. Jacob, you look a sight better than the last time I saw you. This young lady's been taking good care of you, I can see. Jacob's ears turned red, but he nodded politely. Amara's been a big help with the farm work. Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes moved between them, and Amara could practically see the wheels turning in her head. I'm sure she has. You know, I was just talking to the preacher's wife yesterday, and she mentioned something interesting. Seems Marcus has been telling folks around town that this farm's going to be available real soon, acting like he already owns it. Jacob and Amara exchanged worried glances. If Marcus was already spreading rumors, it meant he was confident his plan would work. Course, Mrs. Patterson continued, settling herself more comfortably on the wagon seat. Folks around here don't much like Marcus Hartwell. Too big for his britches, if you ask me. Always trying to push the little farmers out so he can grab up all the good land. What are you saying, Mrs. Patterson? Jacob asked. The old woman's eyes sparkled with mischief. I'm saying you got more friends than you think, Jacob Miller. Sarah was well loved in this community, and people remember how you helped everyone during the bad drought 3 years back. You gave away half your seed when the Johnson family lost their crop, and you never asked for a penny in return. Amara looked at Jacob with new respect. She hadn't known about his kindness to other families in need. Point is, Mrs. Patterson went on, if you needed help bringing in your harvest, I bet you'd find plenty of willing hands. Communities got to stick together, especially when outsiders try to muscle in. Hope flickered in Jacob's eyes for the first time in days. You really think people would help? Honey, I know they would. Question is, are you proud enough to ask? After Mrs. Patterson left, promising to spread the word about a community harvest day, Jacob and Amara sat on the front porch watching the sun set over their wheat fields. The crop wasn't perfect, but it was more than they dared hope for just a month ago. I never told you about the Johnsons, Jacob said quietly. You didn't have to, Amara replied. Mrs. Patterson's right, you're a good man, Jacob. People can see that. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised her. Sarah always wanted children. We tried for years, but... He stopped and shook his head. She used to say the farm was our baby instead. Something we built together and cared for and watched grow. Amara understood what he was really saying. This place wasn't just land and buildings to him. It was the last piece of Sarah he had left. Losing it would be like losing her all over again. We're going to save it, she told him with more confidence than she felt. All of it. Why? Jacob asked, turning to look at her in the fading light. Why does this matter so much to you? Amara touched the wooden bird in her pocket, thinking of her mother's words about having wings. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not just surviving. I'm building something, and nobody's going to take that away from me. As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching in the darkness. Both of them tensed, but this time it wasn't Marcus coming to visit. It was 3 men on horseback, and even in the dim light, Amara could see they weren't friendly neighbors. Jacob Miller? The lead rider called out. That's me, Jacob answered, standing up slowly. Got a message for you from Mr. Hartwell. He's heard you might be planning some kind of harvest party. Wants you to know that could be unwise. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Amara felt her heart racing, but she stood up beside Jacob, showing these men she wasn't afraid. This is my land, Jacob said steadily. I'll harvest it however I see fit. The lead rider laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. For now it's your land, but that could change real fast if you're not careful. After the men rode away, Amara and Jacob stood in the darkness listening to their horses' hoofbeats fade into the distance. He's trying to scare us, Amara said. It's working, Jacob admitted, but Amara felt something fierce and stubborn rising up inside her chest. She'd been threatened by scarier men than Marcus Hartwell, and she was still standing. Let him try, she said. We've got something he doesn't understand. What's that? We've got people who care about us fighting on our side. The community harvest began at sunrise with the sound of wagon wheels and cheerful voices filling the cold morning air. Amara stood at the kitchen window, hardly believing what she was seeing. More than 20 neighbors had shown up to help bring in their crop, including families she'd never even met before. Well, I'll be, Jacob breathed, standing beside her with wonder in his voice. I didn't think. You didn't think people cared about you, Amara finished gently. But they do. Mrs. Patterson had been busy spreading the word, and the response was bigger than any of them had expected. The Wilson family brought their 3 teenage sons and a wagon. Old Mr. Henderson showed up with his cutting tools and 40 years of harvest experience. Even the preacher came with his wife and twin daughters, ready to work. But as the day progressed, Amara began to notice something troubling. Every hour or so, a rider would appear on the hill overlooking their farm. The same men who had threatened them the night before were watching, waiting for something. She tried to tell herself they were just trying to scare people away, but her instincts told her something worse was coming. "Jacob," she said during the midday meal break, pulling him aside. "We need to talk." She pointed toward the hill where another rider had just appeared. "They're not just watching, they're counting, figuring out how many people are here, what we're doing." Jacob's face went grim. "You think Marcus is planning something? I think he's not going to let us succeed without a fight." The afternoon harvest was going so well that some people started talking about finishing the entire crop in just one day. The wheat was coming in better than expected, and if they could get it all to market quickly, Jacob might actually have enough money to make his bank payment. That's when Marcus Hartwell arrived with the sheriff. The whole crowd of workers stopped what they were doing as the 2 men rode up on their horses, official and intimidating in their clean clothes and serious faces. Amara felt her stomach drop like a stone into deep water. "Afternoon, folks," Sheriff Coleman called out in a loud voice. "Sorry to interrupt your work, but I got some business to conduct here." Jacob walked over to meet them, his face pale but determined. "What kind of business, Sheriff?" "Got a complaint filed against you, Jacob. Says here you're using illegal labor." The sheriff pulled out a piece of paper and read from it. "Complaint states that you're harboring a runaway slave and using her to work your farm without proper documentation." The whole crowd went silent. Amara felt like the ground had opened up beneath her feet. She looked around at the faces of the neighbors who had come to help them. Some confused, some shocked, some already backing away like they didn't want to be associated with trouble. "That's ridiculous," Jacob said, but his voice shook. "Amara's not a runaway. I bought her legal and proper from the auction in Millbrook." "Then you won't mind showing me the papers," Sheriff Coleman said. Jacob hurried into the house and came back with the bill of sale from the auction. The sheriff looked it over carefully, then handed it to Marcus, who studied it with cold, calculating eyes. "Everything looks legal here," the sheriff admitted reluctantly. But Marcus wasn't finished. "There's another matter, Sheriff. I've been doing some checking, and it turns out Jacob here owes significant money to the bank. Money he's unlikely to be able to pay even with this harvest. I'm concerned about the welfare of his property if he loses the farm." Amara felt sick as she realized what Marcus was doing. He was trying to plant seeds of doubt in everyone's minds, making them wonder if helping Jacob was worth the risk of getting involved in legal troubles. "The bank payment isn't due for 2 weeks, Jacob said firmly. "And it's none of your concern anyway, Marcus." "Everything in this county is my concern," Marcus replied with a cold smile. "Especially when it affects property values and community stability." Mrs. Patterson, who had been standing quietly with the other neighbors, suddenly stepped forward. "Marcus Hartwell, you ought to be ashamed of yourself," she said in a voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Jacob Miller's been a good neighbor to all of us for 10 years. He's never missed a payment to anybody, and he's got every right to work his own land however he sees fit." "That's right," called out Mr. Wilson. "Jacob helped my family through the drought. We're not abandoning him now." One by one, the other neighbors stepped forward to show their support. Even people who had seemed ready to leave a few minutes ago were now standing firm behind Jacob. Amara felt tears prick her eyes as she watched these virtual strangers choose to fight for them. Marcus's face grew dark with anger. "You people don't understand what you're getting into. This farm is going to fail, and when it does, you'll all look like fools for supporting a lost cause. Only fool I see here is the one who thinks he can bully honest folks," Mrs. Patterson shot back. The sheriff looked uncomfortable with the whole situation. "Marcus, if the papers are legal and the payment isn't due yet, I don't see what else I can do here." Your job, Sheriff, Marcus said sharply. But I suppose that's too much to ask. After Marcus and the sheriff rode away, the harvest continued, but the mood had changed. People worked with grim determination now instead of cheerful cooperation. Everyone understood that this wasn't just about bringing in a crop anymore. It was about standing up to Marcus Hartwell and his attempts to control their community. As the sun began to set, they finished loading the last wagon with wheat. Jacob stood in his empty field, looking overwhelmed by what they'd accomplished in just one day. I don't know how to thank you all, he said to the gathered neighbors. No thanks needed, Mr. Henderson replied. We take care of our own around here. But as people began packing up their tools and heading home, Amara noticed something that made her blood run cold. Marcus was back on the hill watching them again. This time he wasn't alone. There were at least 6 men with him, and they were making no effort to hide. Jacob, she said quietly, pointing toward the hill. Jacob followed her gaze and his face went white. He's not going to let this go. No, Amara agreed. He's not. That night, as they sat in the kitchen counting the money they hoped to make from the wheat, Jacob suddenly stopped and looked at her with serious eyes. Amara, if things go bad tomorrow when we try to take this wheat to market, if Marcus tries to stop us or cause trouble, I want you to know something. What? Jacob reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I filed papers with the territorial office 3 weeks ago. Legal papers that make you a free woman. Amara stared at the document in shock. You? What? I should have told you sooner, but I wanted to wait until they came through official channels. You're not my property anymore, Amara. You haven't been for weeks. You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. Amara felt like the world was spinning around her. Free. She was actually legally free. After all these years, all this pain, she was finally free. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. Jacob looked down at his hands. Because I was afraid you'd leave. And I didn't want you to go. Amara looked around the small kitchen where they'd shared so many meals, where she'd felt safe and valued for the first time in her adult life. She thought about the farm they'd worked so hard to save, about the community that had rallied to help them, about the man who had bought her freedom and then given it back to her without asking for anything in return. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. This is my home too now. Jacob's eyes filled with tears of relief. Even though you don't have to stay? Especially because I don't have to stay. Outside, the wind was picking up, and Amara could smell snow in the air. Tomorrow they would take their wheat to market and face whatever Marcus Hartwell had planned for them. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she chose to be. And that made all the difference in the world. The wagon wheels hit a deep rut in the frozen road, and Amara grabbed the side rail to keep from falling off as their precious wheat bounced dangerously close to spilling. Behind them, 3 more wagons loaded with their harvest followed in a careful line, driven by neighbors who had volunteered to help get the crop to market in Millbrook. The sun was barely up, but they'd started before dawn, hoping to reach town and sell their wheat before Marcus could interfere. Roads getting worse? Jacob muttered, fighting to control the horses as they struggled through another patch of mud that had frozen solid overnight. Should have left even earlier. Amara scanned the horizon nervously. So far, no sign of Marcus or his men, but she could feel trouble coming like a storm building behind the hills. The freedom papers in her coat pocket felt both weightless and heavy at the same time, proof that she was no longer anyone's property, but also a reminder of how much they both had to lose. There, she said, pointing ahead to where the road curved around a stand of bare oak trees. Once we get past those trees, we can see the town. But as their wagon rounded the bend, both of them pulled up short. The road ahead was blocked by a line of men on horseback, at least 8 of them, with Marcus Hartwell sitting tall and proud in the center like a general commanding his army. Whoa! Jacob called to his horses, bringing the wagon to a complete stop. Behind them, the other 3 wagons also halted, their drivers looking worried and confused. Marcus rode forward with that cold smile Amara had learned to hate. Morning, Jacob. Mighty early to be heading to town with such a heavy load. Public road, Marcus. Jacob replied, but his voice was tight with tension. I got every right to travel it. Course you do, Marcus agreed pleasantly. Just thought you might want to reconsider this particular trip. Save yourself some disappointment. What kind of disappointment? Amara asked, though she already suspected the answer. Marcus's smile grew wider and meaner. Well now, funny thing happened yesterday evening. Seems the grain buyer in Millbrook got a visit from some concerned citizens. They explained how buying wheat from certain questionable sources might not be good for business. Jacob's face went white. You can't stop people from buying legal grain. Can't I? Marcus chuckled. You might be surprised what people will do when they understand the consequences of making poor choices. One of the men behind Marcus spoke up, a big, ugly fellow with a scar across his cheek. Maybe we should just take a look at what they're hauling. Make sure it's all legal and proper. That's a fine idea, Briggs, Marcus said. Why don't you and the boys check those wagons for any irregularities? Amara felt her heart start racing as the men began moving toward their wagons. This wasn't just about blocking the road anymore. Marcus was planning to destroy their wheat, probably claim it was contaminated or stolen or something equally false. Without the grain, they'd have no money to pay the bank, and Marcus could buy the farm for practically nothing. You touch one kernel of that wheat and you'll answer to me, Jacob said, climbing down from the wagon with his rifle in his hands. The sight of the gun made all of Marcus's men pause, hands moving toward their own weapons. The morning air crackled with dangerous tension, like lightning about to strike. Now, Jacob, Marcus said in a voice like honey poured over poison. No need for things to get unpleasant. We're all reasonable men here. Are we? Jacob kept the rifle pointed at the ground, but his message was clear. Because it seems to me you're trying to steal food right out of people's mouths. Behind them, Amara heard Mr. Wilson and the other neighbors climbing down from their wagons. She turned to see them approaching with their own tools and weapons, not guns, but axes and hammers and other things that could do plenty of damage if a fight broke out. This wheat belongs to Jacob Miller, Mr. Wilson called out in a strong voice. We helped harvest it legal and proper, and we'll see it gets to market the same way. Marcus's confidence seemed to flicker for just a moment as he realized he wasn't facing one desperate farmer anymore, but a whole group of determined neighbors. But then his smile came back colder than before. Gentlemen, I think you're making a mistake getting involved in this. Jacob's got debts he can't pay, and when the bank forecloses next week, anyone who helped him might find themselves in legal trouble too. What kind of legal trouble? Mrs. Patterson's voice rang out from the back of the group. Amara spun around in surprise. She hadn't even noticed the old woman following them. Well now, Marcus said, clearly not happy to see Mrs. Patterson. Aiding and abetting someone who's about to lose his property to the bank could be seen as fraud. Helping him sell assets that rightfully belong to his creditors. Mrs. Patterson cackled like an angry hen. Marcus Hartwell, you're so full of hot air it's a wonder you don't float away like a balloon. These folks are helping a neighbor, which is more than anyone can say about you. This is your last warning, Marcus said, his friendly mask finally slipping completely. Turn those wagons around and go home, or face the consequences. And what consequences would those be? Jacob asked. Marcus gestured to his men, who began spreading out in a half-circle around the trapped wagons. Accidents happen on these country roads. Wagons overturn, grain gets scattered, people get hurt. Would be a real shame if something like that happened to such nice folks. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Amara could see the fear in some of the neighbors' faces. They had families to think about, children who needed them to come home safe. Marcus was counting on that fear to make them back down. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating, Mr. Henderson stepped forward and stood right next to Jacob, his weathered hands gripping a pitchfork like a weapon. 60 years I've been living in this county, the old man said in a voice steady as stone. Seen plenty of bullies come and go, but I never yet saw one who could stand up to folks when they decided to stand together. One by one, the other neighbors moved forward to stand with Jacob and Mr. Henderson. Even young Tommy Wilson, who couldn't be more than 16, stepped up with his father's axe in his hands. Amara felt something powerful swell in her chest as she watched these people choose courage over fear. She thought of her mother's words about birds having wings, and suddenly she understood what they really meant. Freedom wasn't just about having papers that said you were free, it was about having people who would stand with you when the world tried to clip your wings. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to stand beside Jacob, her own hands steady despite the danger surrounding them. "Looks like you're outnumbered, Marcus," she said clearly. Marcus's face twisted with rage. For a moment, Amara thought he might order his men to attack anyway. Consequences be damned. But then the sound of more hoofbeats echoed from behind them, and everyone turned to see who else was coming. Sheriff Coleman rode into view with 2 deputies, looking tired and annoyed at being dragged out so early in the morning. But when he saw the standoff in the road, his expression grew serious. "What's all this about?" he demanded. "Just a little disagreement about road usage, Sheriff," Marcus said smoothly, his friendly mask sliding back into place. "Nothing that can't be worked out between neighbors." But Jacob wasn't going to let Marcus lie his way out of this. "Sheriff, this man and his gang are blocking a public road and threatening to destroy legally harvested grain. I call that highway robbery." Sheriff Coleman looked around at the scene, the blocked road, the armed men, the frightened but determined neighbors. Even he could see what was really happening here. "Marcus, you and your boys need to clear this road immediately," he said firmly. "These folks have every right to take their goods to market." "Of course, Sheriff," Marcus replied, but his eyes promised that this wasn't over. Just trying to look out for the community's interests. As Marcus and his men reluctantly moved aside, Amara felt a mixture of relief and dread. They'd won this round, but she could see in Marcus's face that he wasn't finished with them. Not by a long shot. The grain market in Millbrook buzzed with the usual morning activity, but Amara could feel hostile eyes watching them from every corner as they pulled their wagons up to the weighing station. Word of their confrontation with Marcus had clearly reached town ahead of them, and people were choosing sides without even knowing the full story. "Keep your head up," Jacob murmured to her as they climbed down from their wagon. "We got nothing to be ashamed of." But Amara could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Even if they managed to sell their wheat, would it be enough to save the farm? And what would Marcus try next? The grain buyer, a nervous little man named Pete Morrison, kept glancing around like he expected trouble to walk through his door any minute. When Jacob approached his counter, Pete's hands actually shook as he reached for his paperwork. "Morning, Pete," Jacob said as calmly as he could. "Got some prime wheat here for you to look at." "Jacob, well, you see," Pete stammered, clearly uncomfortable. "Thing is, I've been getting some concerns about certain suppliers. Questions about the quality of their grain, whether it meets our standards. Have you looked at our wheat yet?" Amara interrupted, stepping up beside Jacob. "Because it seems like you're making judgments before you've even seen what we're selling." Pete's eyes darted between them and the door, like he was expecting Marcus to burst in any second. "Now, miss, I don't think this is really your concern." "It's absolutely my concern," Amara said firmly, pulling her freedom papers from her coat pocket. "I'm a free woman and a partner in this farm. I have every right to be here." The sight of the official papers seemed to surprise Pete and several other people in the market who had been listening to their conversation. Word traveled fast in small towns, and most folks had heard that Jacob had bought a slave to work his farm. But legal freedom papers were a different story entirely. "Well, that is." Pete looked even more flustered now. "Look, Jacob, your wheat's probably fine, but I got to think about my business. If certain influential people in the community think I shouldn't be buying from you." "What certain people?" Mrs. Patterson's voice rang out from behind them. She'd insisted on coming to town with them, claiming she needed supplies, but Amara suspected she'd really come to help however she could. "Now, Mrs. Patterson," Pete said nervously, "you know I can't go naming names." "Don't need to name names when everyone knows who's been spreading poison around this town," the old woman said sharply. "Pete Morrison, your daddy would be ashamed to see you backing down from bullies. He built this business on treating folks fair and square. While Mrs. Patterson gave Pete a piece of her mind, Amara noticed a commotion outside the market building. Through the window, she could see Marcus and several of his men gathering in the street, talking to various townspeople. Whatever they were saying was making people upset. She could see angry gestures and worried faces. "Jacob," she said quietly, touching his arm. "Look outside." Jacob followed her gaze and his jaw tightened. He's not wasting any time spreading more lies. Before they could decide what to do about it, the market door burst open and Marcus himself strode in, flanked by two of his men. He looked around the room like he owned it, his gaze settling on Jacob and Amara with cold satisfaction. "Pete," Marcus called out in a booming voice. "Hope you're not thinking about doing business with these folks. Heard they might be having some legal troubles real soon." "What kind of legal troubles?" Pete asked nervously. Marcus pulled out some official-looking papers and waved them in the air. "Well, seems the banks called in Jacob's loan early. Something about failure to maintain the property properly. Sheriff's on his way over to serve foreclosure papers right now." Amara felt her heart sink like a stone. Even if they sold their wheat, it wouldn't matter if the bank had already started foreclosure proceedings. "That's impossible," Jacob said, but his voice shook with uncertainty. "The payment's not due for another week. Banks can call loans early if they have cause," Marcus said with fake sympathy. "And when a property's not being properly maintained, when there's questionable labor practices, when the borrower's associating with undesirable elements." He shrugged like it was out of his hands. Amara could see the trap closing around them. Marcus had used his influence with the bank to force early foreclosure, probably with promises that he'd buy the property and pay off the debt. It was legal, technically, but it was also the kind of corrupt dealing that happened when rich men decided they wanted something. "You can't do this," she said, stepping forward. "This is Jacob's home, his life's work." "I'm not doing anything," Marcus said smoothly. "The bank's just protecting its investment. Though I suppose I could talk to them, maybe work out some kind of arrangement if Jacob's willing to be reasonable." "What kind of arrangement?" Jacob asked through gritted teeth. Marcus's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Simple. You sign over the property to me for a fair price, say $500, and I'll make sure the bank gets paid. You and your partner can find somewhere else to make a fresh start. $500 for a farm worth 10 times that much." It was theft, pure and simple, but legal theft that would leave them with no recourse. "And if I refuse?" Jacob asked. "Then the bank forecloses, you lose everything, and I buy the property at auction for even less than I'm offering now. Your choice." The market had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching this confrontation, waiting to see what Jacob would do. Amara could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of sympathy and fear and morbid curiosity. Then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, an unexpected voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Excuse me, but I believe there's been some confusion." Everyone turned to see a well-dressed stranger in a black coat and official-looking badge. He was tall and serious, with the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention. "And you are?" Marcus demanded, clearly not pleased by this interruption. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Robert Hayes," the man said, showing his badge. "I'm here investigating reports of banking irregularities and possible fraud in this county." Marcus's face went pale. "Fraud? I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Marshal." "Don't you?" Marshal Hayes pulled out a thick folder of papers. "Because I've got documents here showing some very interesting patterns. Loans being called early, properties being foreclosed under suspicious circumstances, always with the same buyer waiting to snap them up at below-market prices." Amara could hardly believe what she was hearing. Someone had been investigating Marcus's schemes, and now the law was finally catching up with him. "Furthermore," the marshal continued, "I've got sworn statements from several bank employees who say they were pressured to approve irregular loan modifications by certain influential customers. That's a federal crime, Mr. Hartwell." The papers in Marcus's hands suddenly seemed to burn his fingers. "Now see here, Marshal. I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Marshal Hayes said firmly. I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal banking laws. As the marshal's men moved in to arrest Marcus, Amara felt like she was dreaming. After all their fear and struggle, justice was finally coming for the man who had tried to destroy them. But even as Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his eyes found hers across the crowded room. The look he gave her was pure hatred, and she knew that somehow, some way, he would find a way to make them pay for this humiliation. "It's not over," he called out as they dragged him toward the door. "You hear me? It's not over." Amara shivered and moved closer to Jacob. Marcus was right about one thing: this wasn't over. Men like him didn't give up easily, and they had long memories for anyone who crossed them. But for now, they were safe. The foreclosure papers were invalid, their wheat could be sold, and they had a chance to save the farm. It was enough. For now, it was enough. Amara couldn't sleep, and she knew exactly why. The letter that had arrived that afternoon sat on her dresser like a coiled snake, waiting to strike. 3 months had passed since Marcus's arrest, 3 months of peace and hard work and something that felt almost like happiness. But now everything was about to change again, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what the letter might mean. She lit a candle and picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. The return address was from a law office in Kansas City, and she'd been too afraid to open it all day. Letters from lawyers never brought good news to people like her. But as she read the words inside, her legs gave out and she sank onto her bed in shock. This wasn't bad news at all, it was impossible news, the kind of miracle she'd stopped believing in years ago. "Amara?" Jacob's worried voice came through her door, along with a gentle knock. "I saw your light. Is everything all right?" She opened the door with the letter still clutched in her shaking hands. Jacob stood in the hallway in his nightclothes, his hair sticking up funny from sleep, but his eyes were alert and concerned. "I found her," Amara whispered, hardly able to believe the words coming out of her own mouth. "Jacob, I found my daughter." Jacob's eyes went wide. "What? How?" Amara held up the letter, tears streaming down her cheeks. "There's been a lawyer in Kansas City helping freed slaves find their families. Someone told him about me, and he's been searching. Lily, she's alive, Jacob. She's 19 years old now, and she's been looking for me too." Jacob reached out and steadied her as she swayed on her feet, overwhelmed by emotion. "Where is she?" "Kansas City. She's working as a seamstress in a dress shop. The lawyer says she's been saving money, hoping to hire someone to help her find me." Amara laughed through her tears. "All this time, we've both been searching for each other." "That's wonderful," Jacob said, and she could hear the genuine happiness in his voice. "When can you go see her?" The question hit Amara like a punch to the stomach. Go see her. Of course that's what she had to do. Travel to Kansas City and reunite with the daughter she'd lost 12 years ago. But that would mean leaving Jacob, leaving the farm, leaving the life they'd built together. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The lawyer says she could come here instead if I wanted. But Jacob, either way, everything's going to change." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're afraid." "Terrified," Amara admitted. "What if she doesn't remember me? What if she's angry that I couldn't protect her? What if we're strangers now? What if you're not?" Jacob asked gently. "What if she needs you as much as you need her?" That night, they sat at the kitchen table planning Amara's trip to Kansas City. The train would take 2 days and she'd need money for tickets and a hotel room. Jacob insisted on giving her everything they'd saved from the wheat harvest, even though she protested it was too much. "This is the most important thing in the world," he said firmly. "Sarah always said family was worth any sacrifice." Amara looked at this man who had become so dear to her, who was willing to give up their savings so she could reunite with her child. "What about us?" she asked quietly. Jacob was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I want you to be happy, Amara. If being with Lily means staying in Kansas City, then that's what you should do. And if it means bringing her here, then we'll figure out how to make room for one more person in our life." The train station in Millbrook was crowded with travelers, But Amara felt completely alone as she stood on the platform with her small bag of belongings. Jacob had wanted to come with her, but someone needed to stay and watch the farm. So here she was, about to take the biggest leap of faith in her life. "You sure you got everything?" Jacob asked for the third time, checking her bag and her ticket. "I think so." Amara touched the wooden bird in her coat pocket. She decided to bring it as a gift for Lily, something from their shared past. The train whistle blew, and Jacob suddenly pulled her into a fierce hug. "Bring her home if she wants to come," he whispered in her ear. "Both of you belong here now." As the train pulled away from the station, Amara watched Jacob get smaller and smaller until he disappeared completely. The Nebraska countryside rolled past her window, endless fields and big sky and the life she'd built from nothing. Would she ever see it again? Kansas City was bigger and louder and more overwhelming than anything Amara had ever experienced. Buildings stretched up toward the sky like mountains made of brick and glass, and the streets were packed with more people than lived in all of Nebraska Territory. She'd never felt smaller or more lost. The law office was in a fancy building downtown, all polished wood and serious-looking men in expensive suits. But Mr. Franklin, the lawyer who had written to her, turned out to be a kind, elderly man with gentle eyes and a grandfatherly smile. "Mrs. Amara," he said, standing up from his desk when she was shown into his office. "I can't tell you how happy I am to finally meet you. Your daughter is going to be so excited." She wants to see me?" Amara asked, hardly daring to hope. "My dear woman, she's been waiting for this day since she was 7 years old," Mr. Franklin said warmly. "She never stopped believing she'd find you again." He showed Amara to a small waiting room and went to fetch Lily from the dress shop where she worked. As the minutes ticked by, Amara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. What would she say? How do you bridge 12 years of separation with words? Then the door opened, and Amara's breath caught in her throat. The young woman who walked in looked exactly like Amara had at 19. The same dark eyes, the same proud way of holding her head, the same graceful hands. But there was something in Lily's face that Amara recognized from her own mirror, the careful guardedness of someone who had learned not to trust too easily. "Mama!" Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh, my baby girl," Amara breathed, rising from her chair. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, afraid to believe this was real. Then Lily took a tentative step forward, and suddenly they were in each other's arms, crying and laughing and holding on like they'd never let go again. "I thought you were dead," Lily sobbed against Amara's shoulder. "They told me you were sold away and I'd never see you again. I never stopped looking for you," Amara whispered, stroking her daughter's hair. "Not one single day." They talked for hours in Mr. Franklin's office, sharing 12 years of stories and pain and survival. Lily had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where she'd worked in the fields until the war ended and slavery was abolished. Then she'd made her way north, determined to find her mother or at least learn what had happened to her. "I saved every penny I could," Lily explained. "Figured if I had enough money, I could hire people to help me search. That's how I found Mr. Franklin." Amara told her about the years of being sold from place to place, about Jacob buying her freedom and then giving her legal papers to make it official, about the farm in Nebraska Territory that had become her home. "You have a home now?" Lily asked with wonder in her voice. "We have a home," Amara corrected gently. "If you want it." Lily's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I don't want to be a burden. Baby girl, you could never be a burden. You're my heart walking around outside my body." As the sun set over Kansas City, Amara and Lily walked through the busy streets together, getting to know each other again. Lily was smart and strong and independent. She'd built a good life for herself in the city, with a steady job and a small apartment and friends who cared about her. But when Amara described the farm, the wide open spaces and the community of neighbors who looked out for each other, she could see longing in her daughter's eyes. "It sounds like paradise," Lily said softly. "It's not perfect," Amara said honestly. "There's hard work and the winters are brutal, and there are still people who don't think folks like us deserve to be free. But it's ours, Lily. For the first time in our lives, we have a place that belongs to us. That night, lying in the hotel bed next to her daughter, Amara felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since Lily was small. Her family was together again. But she also felt a pull toward Nebraska, toward Jacob and the life they'd built together. "Mama!" Lily's voice came through the darkness. "Yes, baby? Tell me more about Jacob. Are you?" Amara smiled in the dark. "He's a good man, the best man I've ever known. He saved my life, but more than that, he helped me remember who I am underneath all the pain." "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air between them. Did she love Jacob? She'd been so focused on survival, on freedom, on building something stable, that she'd never really examined her feelings. But thinking about his gentle hands and his quiet strength, his willingness to sacrifice for her happiness, she realized the answer had been there all along. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." "Then we should go home," Lily said simply. "All of us deserve to be loved." The train back to Nebraska Territory carried 2 women instead of 1, and Amara's heart felt like it might explode with joy every time she looked at her daughter sitting beside her. Lily had quit her job, packed her few belongings, and decided to trust that this new life would be better than the one she was leaving behind. "Are you nervous?" Amara asked as the familiar landscape of home began appearing outside their window. "Terrified," Lily admitted with a laugh. "But good terrified, if that makes sense. Like when you're about to jump into a swimming hole and you know the water's going to be cold, but you're excited anyway." Amara squeezed her daughter's hand. "Jacob's going to love you, and you're going to love the farm. I just know it." But as the train pulled into Millbrook Station, Amara felt her own nervousness growing. What if Jacob felt awkward about having another person in their carefully balanced life? What if Lily didn't like the isolation of farm living after the bustle of Kansas City? What if she'd made a terrible mistake bringing her daughter into a situation that might not work? Jacob was waiting on the platform, looking anxious and excited and terrified all at the same time. He'd obviously made an effort to dress nicely. His best shirt was ironed and his hair was combed down flat. When he saw Amara stepping off the train, his face lit up with relief and joy. "Welcome home," he said, and the words were like music to Amara's ears. "Jacob," she said, turning to the young woman beside her. "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Lily." Jacob's eyes went wide as he looked at Lily, clearly seeing the resemblance between mother and daughter. "Miss Lily," he said formally, removing his hat. "It's an honor to meet you. Your mother's talked about you every day since I've known her." Lily studied Jacob with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to judge people quickly and accurately. Amara held her breath, waiting to see what her daughter would think of this man who had become so important to her. "Thank you for taking care of my mama," Lily said finally, and her voice was warm with genuine gratitude. "Mr. Franklin told me what you did buying her freedom and then giving her the papers to make it legal. That was a good thing." Jacob's ears turned red with embarrassment. "She took care of herself. And me too, if I'm being honest." The ride back to the farm was filled with easy conversation as Jacob pointed out landmarks and told stories about their neighbors. Amara watched Lily's face as she took in the wide open spaces, the endless sky, the freedom to see for miles in every direction. "It's so quiet," Lily breathed in wonder. "In the city, there's always noise, wagons and people and machines. But here, you can actually hear the wind." "Wait until you see the stars tonight," Jacob said. Sarah used to say the Nebraska sky was God's way of showing off. At the mention of his wife, Lily's expression grew thoughtful. "Mama told me about Sarah. She sounded like a wonderful woman." "She was," Jacob said simply. "I think she would have liked you both very much." When they reached the farm, Lily stood in the yard looking around with amazement. The house looked smaller than it had when Amara first arrived, but it was painted and well-maintained now. The barn stood straight and strong, the fields were clean and ready for spring planting, and Sarah's garden had been restored to neat rows waiting for new seeds. "You did all this?" Lily asked her mother. "We did it," Amara corrected, looking at Jacob. Together. That evening, they sat around the kitchen table sharing a meal that Amara and Lily had cooked together. It felt strange and wonderful to have 3 people in the house again, to hear multiple voices and laughter echoing off the walls. "So what's the plan for spring planting?" Lily asked Jacob, clearly interested in learning about farm life. Jacob launched into an explanation of crop rotation and soil preparation, and Amara watched with amazement as her daughter asked intelligent questions and offered suggestions. Lily had inherited her mother's practical nature and quick mind. "I was thinking," Jacob said carefully, "if you're planning to stay, we might want to add a room onto the house. Give you proper privacy and space of your own." "You'd do that?" Lily asked, surprised. "Course I would. This is your home now too." After Lily went to bed in Amara's room, they decided to share for now, wanting to stay close after so many years apart. Amara and Jacob sat on the front porch looking at the stars. "She's remarkable," Jacob said quietly. "I can see where she gets her strength." "Thank you for welcoming her," Amara said. "I know this changes things between us." "Does it?" Jacob turned to look at her in the moonlight. "Because it seems to me like it just makes our family bigger." "Our family." The words sent warmth spreading through Amara's chest. "Is that what we are? A family?" Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and Amara could see him struggling with something. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, "Amara, I need to tell you something. These past few months, working beside you, building this life together, I've come to care for you. More than care for you." Amara's heart started beating faster. "Jacob, I know it's probably too soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still figuring out your new life with Lily, and I don't want you to feel pressured or like you owe me anything because of what I did." "Jacob," Amara said firmly, putting her hand over his, "stop talking and listen to me." He fell silent, waiting. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think I've loved you for months, but I was too scared to admit it. Scared that if I let myself love someone again, they'd be taken away from me." Jacob's eyes filled with tears. "And now," Amara looked around at the farm they'd saved together, thought about her daughter sleeping safely inside their house, felt the solid warmth of Jacob's hand under hers. "Now I think I'm brave enough to try." Jacob leaned over and kissed her gently, and Amara felt like she was finally, truly home. Not just in a place, but in her own skin, in her own life, in the love of people who chose to be with her. The next morning, Lily found them having coffee together in the kitchen, sitting closer than usual and sharing secret smiles. "So," she said with a grin as she poured herself a cup, "when's the wedding?" Amara nearly choked on her coffee. "Lily, what? I'm not blind, Mama. You two are clearly crazy about each other, and I think it's wonderful." Jacob's ears turned bright red, but he was smiling. "Well, I suppose we should probably ask her properly first." "Ask me what?" Amara said, though her heart was already racing. Jacob stood up and took her hands in his, suddenly serious. "Amara, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and help me build something beautiful on this land?" Amara looked into his kind eyes, thought about all the dreams she'd never dared to dream, all the happiness she'd never thought she deserved. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." As they held each other in the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, Lily applauded and laughed with joy. Outside, spring was coming to Nebraska Territory, bringing with it the promise of new growth, new beginnings, and a future built on love instead of survival. For the first time in her life, Amara wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She was home, she was free, and she was loved. The wooden bird in her pocket seemed to flutter its wings with joy, ready at last to sing its song of freedom.